Alrighty, guys. In the fine tradition of me running things, I sort of get the name wrong. I think it's my sword is better than your sword.
Yes, my
okay.
sword is yours.
Awesome. For once, I get the name right. So my name is Keith Cotter Riley. I'm part of the local historical fencing group here in Atlanta. We're called Atlanta Trifector, and this is my good friends.
I'm Alan Johnson. I'm with the Palmetto Knights. We're based out of Columbia, South Carolina. Yeah, we do a lot of the same stuff, and we talk sharp, pointy things. That's what we're here for.
So today's class is basically just going through various different sword types from all over the world as best we can. I will self-admit, I am more Eurocentric or Japanese-centric. So when we get to the Sino and the Indian swords, I'm going to be a little bit iffy. I know a little, but if you ask me detailed questions, I'm going to gloss. Okay. So my knowledge basically comes from about 15th century up to modern day. Alan, what's your main focus?
Again, it's a lot of that same time period and a little bit of the more medieval into the Viking stuff.
Yeah,
some of that stuff.
So you probably know a little bit more. So let's go time period wise.
Yeah.
So if you want to...
Well, let's start with the earliest weapon, at least that we have representation of here, is this is your typical Viking era sword. Very small grip, nice wide cutting blade. There's enough of a blade presence you can do thrusting, but this is mainly a cutter. It's used in conjunction, usually with a round center grip shield. Very little cross. There was never much of a cross with this type of a weapon beyond just that. This grip is actually a little long for a Viking blade. A lot of times you'd actually see the grip coming down up off the pommel like that. But a lot of the metallurgy, the Vikings were extremely good at making steel, and a lot of the techniques that they were using in constructing these blades, for instance, it's the same style that was being used to make the katanas, but just by around 1500. So they were about 1,000 years ahead of Japan as far as their metallurgical capabilities and what they were able to do. Very strong blades, very good cutters. They have this nice wide deep fuller on a lot of them. Not a blood groove. Anybody you've heard that before, the notch in the center of the blade. It is not a blood groove. It does not create a vacuum. Nobody in the history of our has stabbed somebody and all of a sudden the blade goes inside and they're searching in the body cavity for the blade to pull it back out. This is a fuller. It reduces the amount of weight in a blade, and it also creates a little bit of strength because you're basically creating triangles on the end, which is a very geometrically strong shape. So it's a good, strong cutter.
Yeah. We're being very careful with this one because this one's actually really sharp. Some of these are
Most
sharp
of these are
today.
blunt,
So yeah. Most of you probably can't see it, so when we later on get this back up on the wall, you'll see a pattern on here, right? This is etched. This is the Indian company makes this. Yeah.
This is windlass.
So it's not proper, but they are representing how it would be. How these swords were commonly made is, again, like the Japanese sword, where you got a hard steel and a soft steel. But the difference would they would twist the bars. They would make at least 3 bars, then twist the bars together, and then weld them together. And you get beautiful patterns. And these guys knew exactly what they were doing. Honestly, I find them more beautiful than everything but the top katanas. Like the top 1%, they're awesome. But when you get to regular katana versus regular this style of sword just for beauty, some of the things the smiths could do back in those days, they're just amazing.
And you're thinking this is 8th century AD.
Yeah.
That we're talking 8th, 9th century. It's remarkable what they were able to do. So let's move on a few hundred years later. We get into a single-handed, we typically call an arming sword. This would again be used in conjunction usually with a shield or sometimes an offhand knife. You get a little bit of a longer blade. We're getting a little bit more of a taper going to it, and we have the advent of the longer hilt, and this protects the hand a lot more from incoming blows. This was used both with armored fighting and with unarmored fighting. The earliest martial art manual that we have for Europe is this sword with a buckler. I didn't grab it.
Don't really have.
Yeah.
If you see right behind us in the corner back here, you see the small
Flat round shield.
Yeah, make that
Can you stand up and grab
Why don't you go ahead and grab that
shield?
and crowd surf it forward?
The black shield.
The black one.
The small black one on the ground. Yeah, that's it. Yep.
Yeah, there we go.
That's
This is a buckler.
You can get a small, like, 33 demo.
So this is actually pretty on the extreme end of bigness, which I actually prefer. There's a few different ways to use these in conjunction with the sword. The manual that Alan's talking about is called I-33, which is probably the most complex one we know, which probably means those guys knew what they're doing. But whenever I'm attacking, my hand is always protected by the buckler, right? In I-33, they rarely cut into the attack. They're trying to get a bind, so sword versus sword, and then working off that, using the buckler to move the sword aside to get in for a thrust. It's really hard, so I'm just going to, pretty much everybody can get a good view of me, right? So, can everybody see my elbow? Right? This is bad, okay? But all I'm going to do is twist and lock out. Can you see, you can probably see my jaw, but you can probably not see anything else going from my jaw to my waist, because the buckler is in the way. This is really hard to get through.
Because if I'm dealing with a rigid thing, and again, this weapon would not encounter this one, you know, it's the angle is such that it's deflecting off to the side, no matter where I place it. And his arm is keeping it from going any further. If you think about somebody spraying you with a hose, you keep your hands out here, and it deflects it more than if you keep it close. If he keeps it close to his body, then it's only this immediate area that's being protected. If he pulls it out, he's now covering a much larger area. So that was the idea of keeping that buckler arm extended.
I have a friend whose buckler is only about this big, and nobody can hit him. And all he does is keeps it here, and he moves about 1/3 of an inch up or 1/3 of an inch down, and nobody can hit him. All right.
It's remarkable.
Yeah.
So arming sword.
Arming sword. It's very obvious going from the Viking sword to this sword, all right? The big technological difference is actually this. Does anyone know what this is called? Pommel, right? The pommel on the Viking sword is normally hollow. It's just an end cap. They now have a counterweight, right? And that's the real purpose of a pommel. Now, saying that this is constructed somewhat like the katana in that the handle acts as the counterweight, but now they've just added more of a counterweight to it. Okay.
Which makes your blade work faster. All right, so from there, let's go Messer.
Messer. So we're sticking European, then we'll get to Asian.
What was the time period?
So there's an overlap between this sword and this sword. So about 900, 1000 AD, up to about 1400. Like you'll see swords like this all the way into the Renaissance period. But by then, if you have a sword like that, you're probably poor. It's a family heirloom.
Granddad's sword.
Yeah,
And again, we
same
like
bucklers we still use.
In modern day, we like swords especially to fit in these nice little cubby holes. And if it's this measurement or has this thing, it goes into this little cubby hole and goes in this. It's a constant transition. And so you'll find lots of blades that are transitional pieces, in-betweeners between these major types.
So the next one, this is known as a Langsmesser, or if you speak German, that just means long knife, because that's essentially what this is. Does anybody know what a Langsmesser is before I talk? Nobody? Well, you don't count. So a Langsmesser is, like it says, a long knife. Traditionally, these were made by knife makers who were forbidden from making swords. Okay. Now there's this myth that these swords were made because only noblemen or higher class people were allowed to carry swords, and so the peasants and the lower class would get these to skirt the law. That's not how laws work. This was probably done as a way to get around guild rules, right? You can make more money. Yeah, unions. Yeah, you can make more money making one of these. It'll take maybe 2 days, 3 days longer to knock out a munitions grade one, and you can ask for 4 or 5 times the worth of his knife. So that's probably why they came about. But you may notice the construction of the handle. This one's wrapped, so we don't really see what's inside. But this guy's got a pommel back here, and the tang tapers into this, and then on the bottom, it's pretty hard to see because they did a really nice job. It's peened off. That just means that it was heated and then hammered down so it becomes one. You can probably see like a nail that goes through my pommel here, right? There's a nail here, nail here, nail here, and a nail here. And that's how it is constructed. It's constructed just like knives. Knives to this day are still constructed like this. Okay? Yes. The noggle as well is an addition for hand protection. So if I mess up my parry and he slides down, my hand is now safe. This also lets me do cool stuff like controlling. Okay? Which Messer was really known for. There is a text. And by the way, Messers go all the way from this length, which is about an average length, up to like yay tall. Kriegmesser. So the Nodachi over here, take about a half foot off the blade, and you could find swords like that, built like this, and they were called Kriegmesser. They were two-handed war swords. Okay, everybody owned these, from the peasant to the noble. Some of the nicest swords you'll find are Messers.
In the Germanic culture.
In Germanic, yes.
So let's get into our long swords.
Sure. That one's sharpish.
Ish. All right, so as we get advances in metallurgy, we start to get better. We start to make longer blades. That's why they didn't exist before, because they didn't have, they weren't able to make them well enough without breaking, without getting to this length. And these things have to be flexible. They have to be able to bend and return to true, and that's good forging, and they didn't really have that capability early on, but now we're getting to the point where we do, so we can get some of these longer long swords. Long sword, hand and a half, bastard swords. They're all basically synonymous terms, if you've heard those words. They're all basically this sword type, depending on the blade profile. Sometimes you can use them with one hand, sometimes you can use them with two. But this kind of was really a big boom. These were used all over Europe, and they are some of the main focuses of the vast majority of our manuals from that time period, dealing with the longsword. Some people called it like a foundational weapon. If you mastered this, your transition to the other types of weapons became much easier if you were able to master how to use the longsword. And we have so many wonderful manuals that show how this weapon is being used. Most of our stuff comes from Germany or Italy. When it comes to longsword, we have some English longsword texts, but they're a little bit more archaic.
Yeah, they're
difficult.
A lot of the earlier texts are written in poem form, because that's what they did. And the English liked their poems. So even though the English manual is like a Manitowoc, which I can't remember what it's translated to modern English, it's written in like 1520, 1530, when the Germans were now going, to do this technique, do A, B, C, and D. Okay, they're getting like how we would do it. The English guy's still like, and here's a fancy poem about a serpent's tail.
Yeah.
You're like, I no
Strike
idea.
like the hawkbat from above.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't even know what a hawkbat is.
Yeah. So what I have in my hand, so we'll pick this up. These come from two slightly different time periods. You can tell. Actually, no. Well, yeah, yours we could probably consider a war sword or a great sword, whereas this is a trainer. We don't really know what they call these, but this is sort of the weapon, at least in Germany and in France and like the lowlands. We know they use this for training. We call them a Federschwert, which just means feather sword.
It doesn't really feel like a feather.
It doesn't feel like a feather, but that's what it's called. And this one's a little later in time period. You can see I can put 1, 2, no, 3, 3.5 hands of my hands on this handle, right? It's a really long handle, whereas he can only fit 2, right? What made these nice is they got a little bit of flex in them. So if I thrust, for nowadays we include thrusting in our training, I'm not going to hurt you. He thrusts with that, it'll flex after it goes in me.
You don't want to train sparring with this one because of the tip and the edges. But this one's good for it.
The weight's also been pulled back, so the point of balance is back here. So if I hit you, it's not going to break you.
Yeah. Yeah, there's less mass at the business end of the blade, so it's a little bit kinder in practicing. But this one will do lots of damage.
But this is a traditional style of how, at least in Germany, we know in France and the Lowlands, they trained for these. They weigh about the same.
We didn't really talk much about weights, did we?
We didn't. I'm going to
just
do this
as
real
a quick
quickly.
real
Could you
recap.
hold this for me, please?
Viking era swords
very heavy.
typically weighed about 2.5 pounds,
To you it is.
sometimes
To me it
even
is.
lighter. Arming swords are still about the same range, a little 2.5, maybe getting up into 3 pounds, some
Yeah.
of them. Your early long swords are going to be 3.5. Sometimes the heavier ones, I think mine is close to 4, and that's a little bit beefier than it should be. The messers are depending on the length, between 2 pounds on up to 3.5.
So the average, like, I have a long sword, a sharp, that's nigh on identical to this. It weighs 3 pounds and 4 ounces.
So
Right.
a lot lighter than most people think. Even our big, we don't have any true two-handers here today. But even
There's this claymore behind us, but it's
sort of
ish.
that's
It's not
really real. But the claymores, the Montantes, the Zweihanders, Beidenhanders that can get 5, 5.5, sometimes even 6 feet tall. Even those weigh no more than 5, 6, 7 pounds.
And once you get used to them, once you start swinging them, they're not heavy. I have a good friend, James Clark. He can swing his Zweihander for like 15, 20 minutes, and it's a warm-up. These swords are designed to be used, right? They're designed for you being stuck in a battle for a really long time and not being tired from using your weapon. So, moving on. Okay. So, this has several different names. In English world, we call it a Sinclair Sabre, named after a Scottish gentleman who failed at his job. He was a mercenary for the Norwegian king, who's known for getting all of his men killed. But the Scots saw these and they loved them. Probably, we'll get to that sword in a bit. They guess that this sword influenced that sword. But this is actually comes from this. One of the theories is they ran into the Turks a lot. The Ottoman Empire was the dominant empire in the Western world at that time. They would raid and try to take over Eastern and Central Europe a lot. And the Messer's not a good sword to go up against the Shamshir or any of their sabers. So we think they came up with this design. It's got really good hand protection. The blade normally is curved, but you will find messer blades on these too. We don't unfortunately have a falchion. A falchion and a messer are essentially the same sword. The only difference is how is the furniture constructed. Okay, so if you talk about a falchion, it's going to have arming sword furniture there. So how it's peened, the pommel and everything is essentially the same.
Some varieties of the falchion had more blade mass at the end, so some of them will have a flare out towards the tip to make it a bit more impactful for those chops.
But for the average blade style, there's really not much of a difference. So the falchion, the messer sort of convalesce into this. I have fenced without real hand protection with this, and nobody's ever come close to hitting me, because this works really well. Now I need wrist protection, because that's a very common spot to aim when you're against this type of weapon, right? These are really, really nice, and nearly everybody had them. Most of them nowadays are actually in Sweden and Norway, because the king of Norway decreed that by 1600, every farmer, every landowner needed a sword, and Norway was poor. So he personally bought 4,000 dusaks from Germany and sold them at cost to the farmers. No, it's not odd. They were going to war with Sweden.
Here, I'll sell you the sword. Now you're gonna go die for me.
Yeah, that's essentially what was happening.
Yeah, let's make it
Rapiers?
Yeah.
Oh, he wanted to live. That's the only way. So,
Once we start getting into the late 1500s and into the 1600s, we start to see the advent of these complex hilts. This is what we would call a rapier. There's been a lot of different sword types that are called rapiers. When you start going back into the 1500s, you will see some that have a wider blade as it goes down, and those can do both cutting and thrusting. But once we get to about the 1600, and specifically this style, it's almost exclusively a thrusting weapon. In the manuals that show this, they show a handful of cutting attacks, but they're really just harassing cuts to try and set up something lethal with a thrust. They were often used in conjunction with an offhand dagger of some sort. So the idea would be to deflect and then counterattack any number of ways with, this tandem. It took a lot of training. It really changed the style because when we're working with a lot of the cutting blades, assuming a right-handed fencer, we usually take up a stance as a left foot forward. This changed because it's a foining weapon, it's almost thrusting only. The stance changed to more of a sword hand, so for a right-hander, it'd be right hand forward, and this is extended.
Another thing, if you're noticing me, I'm going to a traditional discard, in German it's known as Vom Tag. What's my hand doing? Where is it?
Cover.
It's back, right? I'm retreated. This is another common guard known as Ox. Where's my hand?
In the back.
In the back. When I cut, I make sure the blade is leading. He doesn't have to worry about this now. So I aim for his hand, I'm going to hit cover.
And I
Right?
have these fun, fancy things that I can try and bind with and cover off and get their sword entangled with. This ring, you'll see this time a lot of time on daggers. This is not to stick your finger through, despite what Orlando Bloom does on the poster for the Three Musketeers. That's a good way to get your finger chopped. It works the same way as the Nagel on the Messer. That's to protect your hand from getting cut by that. So if you ever see somebody with sticking their finger through that, they haven't really done their homework.
Is there a particular reason for the difference in design? Like, is it
Which design?
the ring as opposed to, for the parrying dagger, the ring as opposed to just an extension?
This is it covers a bit more. It's a circular pattern, and eventually you'll see different styles. Like you see this one on the wall, it actually has a shell coming over the hand on the dagger there. So depending on the style, sometimes you'll see a little bit almost like a clamshell thing covering the hand. Sometimes this ring came out a little further, and sometimes it was filled, like it was a plate that prevented even anything from thrusting through there. Some of the rapiers, you get like the Pappenheimer style, if you've seen that. You get these clamshells that kind of come over the top.
Yeah, we actually have one up there.
Right, next to that one there. So it's a plate that's covering the hand as opposed to bars. So it's just a lot of its style, the slight evolution. That came a little bit later than this style. So
I just want to talk, because we covered this really quickly. So this weapon, more than the rapier, is a weapon of war, okay? But what do you notice about my handguard? What does it have in it?
Hearts.
Hearts. This is pretty, right? Mm-hmm. So most of the time, I can't because I got my keys in there. Oh, here we go. Boom. Most of the time, my sword is going to be here. And I'm a young German gentleman around town who's showing off to the ladies that I'm warlike, more than this gentleman who's just got a civilian weapon. But his civilian weapon's also pretty.
it's bling. It's male
It's
bling.
bling. This is
male
all these
jewelry.
are at the end of the day. So, if it is unlikely that if he's got a blingy rapier, that he will have this. This is a poor man's one. Okay? This Dusak is a richer man's Dusak. I can afford to have somebody take the time to put this stuff in there. Right? So, swords are fashion items. I'm just going to go back to this guy. This is one of the plainest Viking era swords you can get because it's a reproduction from India. They do a nice job, but that's what, right? If you are willing to pay $4, $5, $6, $10, $15,000 today, you can get reproductions of what they would look like back in the day, and they were gorgeous. They were inlaid with bone, with horn, with silver, with bronze, with gold, with dragons and all this stuff. That's how they were worn.
So that $5,000, is that to scale, comparative?
That would be like, there's a gentleman in Poland. That's his entry level to do it, because he does it.
But I
as
mean,
per.
back in the day, would
Oh
that
yeah,
be
yeah,
comparable
yeah.
for what
Yeah,
they would
so
pay back
actually swords today would cost about the same as
Yeah.
they did back then. But average guy, okay, by the time we get to this era, the rapier and the other stuff,
1600s.
1600s, the average person with an average job could afford a sword. In fact, you were required to in lots of cities.
In about 10 minutes.
Yeah.
This one is kind of an in-between weapon. It's a mortuary hilt. Actually, the blade should be a little bit wider and a little bit longer, but it's scaled down a little bit for safer sparring. This is a decent cut and thrust weapon. Has a good amount of hand protection here. This is something that you could carry into war, and it's kind of a bridge between the Scottish broadsword and small sword. This one is a much wider cutting blade, and this is almost exclusively a thrusting. There's almost no edge on this. This is a triangular blade. So this might be a little heavy to deal with this, because these were contemporaries. The small sword and the broadsword were contemporaries. Usually you wouldn't carry this off into war unless you're the guy sitting on the horse watching it through the spyglass. This is something you could actually fight with. So somebody might want a in-between weapon that they can carry with them all the time that's fast enough to deal with the small swords and yet still has some of the cutting ability of the broadsword. Another quick note, this is the only historical weapon that was actually called a broadsword. There is we have no documentation of any medieval or Renaissance weapon having the name of broadsword, only this guy.
What else was this called? Claymore.
Specifically by the Highland Scots.
That's a claymore too. Do you know what claymore means?
Big freaking
Big
sword?
sword.
Yeah. It's their word they can use.
Yes, it's just basically broadsword.
And a lot of times, because Scotland was such a poor nation, that they'd repurpose blades. So a broken big one like that might get repurposed into this. If this broke, it might get repurposed into a dirk. That's that downward angle looking thing over there. It's kind of a modern interpretation of a dirk.
Very quickly, because we want to get into the Asian weapons because they deserve it too. This is only a civilian weapon. It was used only for dueling. It was a gentleman's sword, and most of them did not ever expect to use it. But to be a true English gentleman, or then went into Europe, France and Germany, you were expected to carry a sword. If you did not have a sword, you had a cane. If you had neither, you were not a gentleman.
Yeah, and I think that. Oh, and then just real quick,
Sabers.
when you go into, we're talking about getting into the 18th century and 19th century, we have different types of military sabers. And that's where these come in.
Yeah.
And
That's a French one, it looks like.
I believe so.
I think that's a
supposed to be.
French infantry mid-19th century. This is a German. This Kriegsmann is a training version of it. But if you look at the blade and the width, this is correct. This was considered an infantry officer's saber. Sabers are not heavy, despite what the movies like to tell us.
Until we start getting into this American Civil War, where they weren't really being used for actual sword fighting anyway.
Yeah, if you look at the American sabers, don't view, because we are blessed and cursed in this country with having a lot of sabers because of the Indian Wars and the Civil War. American cavalry was not true cavalry. They were dragoons. A dragoon is mounted infantry. Okay, so they didn't really use these. They used their revolvers and their rifles. In Europe, lots of the colonial forces still used their sabers. So their sabers are actually proper swords. They are balanced correctly because, and let's actually go straight to the tulwar.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I'm an English officer, and I've been posted to Peshawar, which is, northern India. I will fight one of these. This is a Talwar, Shamshar. They got lots of different names, and they're a generic saber type for northern India into Afghanistan and that area. Most of the blades actually come from Germany. Solingen, yeah, because at that time period, European metallurgy was the best in the world, actually for a very long time. Okay, So we would end up fighting against this. I needed a light sword that could do this.
Do you want the?
Let's do the Chinese swords really quickly. Because of our interests, we obviously did way too much on the European swords. So we're rushing through the Japanese or the Chinese and the Japanese swords. This is a GN. This is a correct sword. You see them all the time in kung fu movies. They sort of were used like they use them in the kung fu movies when they're not flying all over the place. It's a thrusting sword with cutting capability, but ideally you thrust with it. So essentially view it as the equivalent of this, just with a better cutting capability. This is a Dao. This is sharp, so we're going to be careful. Switch. Thank you. This is their cutting sword, or saber. Okay, and you use it essentially like you would a heavy, like the broadsword over here. You would use this on horseback and on foot. The sword has no pommel, so all the way right now, you see my hands dipping down, that's because the sword wants me to do this. But we use them in this type of action. I'm trying to stay low so that I hit the ceiling, right? Again, yes. And then finally, everybody knows about the katana. This sword is simply a saber that I can use with two hands. It is not the best sword in the world. It is not the worst sword in the world. It is simply a sword.
It's made out of steel and is susceptible to the laws of physics.
Yes. They made these swords in a particular way because the steel, or rather the iron in Japan, is crap.
It is very dirty. That's
Okay.
why they had to hammer it so much to get rid of all the impurities.
Yeah, and by doing that, they basically ended up making the same type of sword as the Viking sword. These are really good cutters
Against soft targets.
against soft targets, not hard targets. But they had good armor, so they finished just like we would, aiming at the soft areas. The curve comes about because of how it's made. They didn't do this on purpose. Okay, when they quench, because they got a soft steel or hard steel edge, soft steel back. The soft steel actually is a misnomer, is what gives it its strength. When they quench it, it causes the curve. A good swordsmith can quench it where they get the angle of the curve they want. But originally, when they first did this, that's why it happened. Over time, they've now perfected it so where they can get the curve they want. Okay, and I think we've
We've got
out
a
of time.
few minutes. How much time have we got?
None.
None.
And 150 people waiting to try to do this all over.
All right.
Okay, I'm so sorry, guys.
Everyone-